Hi, welcome to clip 2 in this week's lecture on structure and the concept of structure and the theoretical current of structuralism. So, as I do every week, I will try in this clip to convey to you the core idea of structuralism. That's a pretty tall order because structuralism is deep and complex. In fact, depth and complexity are two of the characteristics that it really highlights itself. It's kind of part of what it's all about, as I'll explain immediately now. I just wanted to say that the sheer intricacy and complexity of the slide in front of you, or the diagram that I've kind of devised in order to convey the central idea, somehow cuts against my attempt to be super simple. But in a way, that is the point of kind of conveying the intricacy and beauty of Lévi-Strauss's model of structuralism, or of structuralism as we know it since Lévi-Strauss, through the visual of this diagram. So some kind of remnant or trace of the intricacy of Lévi-Strauss's thought is reflected in the diagram, but in what I say about the diagram and about Lévi-Strauss, I will try to be super simple. And really the core idea is really just this. Societies and cultures, social and cultural phenomena, are not just what they seem, just what you see. They are expressions of underlying codes that make them possible. Underlying what we see around us, what we experience, what we hear, what we smell, etc., as we go through our social and cultural existence in the world as human beings, is a matrix of a set of possibilities that allows these intricate things that we experience to happen, right? So the job of the structuralist anthropologist is to delve from the surface of what he or she or they experience, along with the people with whom they are studying, and down into the level of the underlying matrix of possibilities that makes those social phenomena possible. What happens at the surface is in some ways accidental. What is necessary, what is non-accidental, what is non-contingent, are the underlying structures that make that accidental stuff possible in the first place. So the job of the anthropologist is to move from the surface accidental level and decode it in order to find the underlying matrix of possibilities that surface expresses. And according to Lévi-Strauss, and here he aligns himself with Durkheim and Durkheim's nephew Marcel Mauss, who was Lévi-Strauss's teacher, identifying these underlying matrices of possibility, these codes, will allow us to explain. They will furnish the explanation of the surface phenomena that we find. So in some senses, Lévi-Strauss is continuing that European Enlightenment, particularly French project of trying to explain the social cultural world around us. But he thinks that this explanation must take the form of a kind of decoding of the phenomena that we experience in terms of the underlying matrices of possibility that they express. And as we'll see, as Lévi-Strauss's career develops, the kind of late Lévi-Strauss becomes less interested in this attempt to use these codes to explain stuff, but rather becomes really interested in the properties of those codes in their own right. So he loses a little bit interest in this project of explanation as his career develops and as his thinking develops. So both the stuff that we associate with Durkheim, social facts and social structures, which is on the left side of my slide, and the kind of meanings that make up cultures, which are associated with the American kind of cultural anthropology tradition that we looked at last week, Lévi-Strauss hedges his bets on that distinction. He's very happy to treat both of those levels together as grist to the anthropological mill, because both of those, he would say, are underpinned by underlying structures. And I put on this slide just a kind of imaginary example of what we might mean by an underlying structure or code for Lévi-Strauss. So if we're talking about social structures, and we're being kind of sociological about it, we might, for example, think about hierarchies and say, well, some people are higher in the pecking order and some people are lower in the pecking order. That distinction between the high and the low might be one of the underlying possibilities that our matrix, our underlying matrix or code allows for, right? So in any given society, some people might be high in the hierarchy and some other people might be low in the hierarchy. And that's, impossible to determine with reference only to the underlying structure. But that very possibility that someone might be high and someone might be low is what the underlying structure, the underlying code provides for, right? Some relationships may be close, some may be more distant. Again, the distinction between the close and the remote would be something that is part of the underlying code in trying to understand a particular social configuration, right? On the other side of the slide, if we're talking about cultures, let's talk about meanings, right? So you see, I put here some little cloud structures and some little circles and some kind of lunar kind of structures. Some of them are colored in particular ways, red, blue, yellow. Some of them are patterned and so on. All of those things that I just used to describe that little diagram of mine are appeals to an underlying set of possibilities that this diagram expresses. So the distinction between the see-through and the solid, the green, the blue, the yellow, and the black, the cloud and the planet and the moon, the vapor and the solid, right? The patterned and the unpatterned. All of these underlying structural possibilities are being deployed in this diagram that I have there, which is supposed to stand for a kind of cultural artifact of some kind, right? And the anthropologist's job is to decode, to see what this surface phenomenon, what kind of underlying code-like possibilities it relies on, and by pointing to those underlying structures, explain the formation of that cultural artifact that the anthropologist is interested in. You see, so you've got this movement with structuralism from surface down to depth and back up again. And those are the arrows that I put on the two extremes of the diagram. Sorry, my slides were being a bit slow there. So the core idea here actually can be expressed with reference to an analogy with language. Social and cultural phenomena, for the structuralist, are a bit like languages. So structuralists agree with what the people that we saw last week, the people who see everything in terms of culture, the culturalists. Remember that they had this idea that societies are cultural phenomena because they make sense in terms of meanings, right? Remember this emphasis on meaning that culturalism involves, and the analogy that Clifford Geertz made between cultural phenomena and texts. So culture is like a text, right? So the structuralists agree with this. So for example, the distinction that we saw a few weeks ago between matrilineal and patrilineal societies, which is a structural distinction in the way that a particular society might be organized, depends on a local meaningful distinction between the male and the female, and between, for example, what it is to be a mother and what it is to be a father, right? So social structures do indeed depend on meaning. So thus far, the structuralist and the culturalist are in agreement. But where the disagreement emerges, where the distinction is between, say, someone like Clifford Geertz and someone like Levi-Strauss, and by the way, Clifford Geertz couldn't stand Levi-Strauss. He's written plenty of really nasty articles about structuralism and Levi-Strauss, but this is indicative of the distinction that I'm about to make. For the structuralist, one has to get beyond the subjectivism of this kind of textual interpretation that the culturalists like Clifford Geertz or the students of Franz Boas and so on were making, because it is too much remaining on the surface of things, and it fails into account that those text-like cultural and social formations that we're interested in as anthropologists are the way that they are because they're underpinned by a set of underlying principles, right? So we have to develop the underlying, a study of the underlying principles rather than trying to interpret the surface if we're going to properly scientifically study these phenomena as we should from Lévi-Strauss's point of view. Lévi-Strauss, as I said in the previous clip or previous slide, is at least in the early part of his career invested in this idea of science, right? So yes, cultures and societies are like texts, but if we take that analogy seriously, let's think about how language works. And what we'll find is that the uses that we make of language when we communicate are only possible because the underlying code of language makes them possible. And in arriving at this thought, Lévi-Strauss is borrowing or being inspired by the Swiss linguist with whom he had a very kind of interesting relationship of inspiration via another linguist that he knew personally. Anyway, I won't go into that story. That's another story because we don't have time to go into the history. So Ferdinand de Saussure's distinction in structural linguistics between the level of langue and the level of parole, right? So speech versus language, parole being speech and language being langue being language, right? So I am using speech right now to convey to you certain meanings, but that is only possible because there is an underlying code-like set of possibilities that I am deploying, right? So there's a vocabulary, there's syntax, there's phonetics, all of those elements that linguists study have certain structures, certain possibilities that might be accidentally, in the sense of historically and contingently, used by me right now in my attempt to communicate with you, right? So if I want to understand language by using my speech as an example, what I do is I refer down into the depth of the underlying code that I'm deploying in order to understand what I'm doing. It's not enough just to look at what I have said on the surface, but in order to understand my capacity to use speech scientifically, I have to refer it downwards onto the underlying principles that inform it. And in particular for de Saussure, langue consists in structured relationships between relationships, if you like, between signs, right? So signs are structurally related to each other and form codes, right? Now there's a whole technical vocabulary around that structuralists use, and you will probably find in your readings of Lévi-Strauss, for example, the distinction between the signifier and the signified. So the signifier is the symbol that I might use in order to pick out a particular concept that I'm trying to convey, and that the symbol is the signifier and the concept that I'm trying to convey is the signified, and that relationship is arbitrary. So for example, if I want to convey the concept of a dog, in English I do it by saying dog. In Greek I say it by saying skili. In Spanish I say it by saying perro, right? All these are different signifiers of the same signified, and the relationship between those signifiers and the signified that they convey is arbitrary. That relationship is arbitrary. That's the famous doctrine of the arbitrariness of the sign. Now, I don't want to go into the details of all of this because that's not really the point of this lecture. You can certainly read Lévi-Strauss or indeed Ferdinand de Saussure himself to find out more about this. But the point is that in studying the surface social and cultural phenomena that we're interested in as anthropologists, our role and our duty, if we're structuralists, is to go deep into these structured relationships between the signs that make these surface phenomena possible. So decoding is the name of the game, if you like, if you're a structuralist anthropologist. So finally, for this clip, what's the core agenda then for a structuralist anthropologist? What are they interested in? So there's a whole bunch of things here to say, but I'm just going to give you a flavor. I've also put in a really nice little YouTube clip where the great French philosopher Michel Foucault talks about structuralism. I put that up on YouTube, sorry, on Moodle so you can watch it. It's just a little fragment between the 7th and the 9th minute where he talks about Levi-Strauss, and he gives a very vivid account of what I'm talking about. The structuralists love to look for patterns of relationships that underlie the observable stuff that we see around us as anthropologists as we go through our social and cultural lives, right? What are the underlying patterns? That's the key question, right? They're interested in creating functions as if there's a kind of underlying algebra. So function not in the sense of, what is this useful for, as we saw with the structural functionalists in Britain, but rather function in the algebraic sense. How does one part of the code become a function and is internally related with the other? Could we develop a formula? Could we develop a formula about how the different bits of the underlying code relate to each other, right? Levi-Strauss does indeed go so far as to formulate a formula, for example, for how myths operate, how myths manipulate relations to generate meaning, right? Structuralist anthropologists are interested in comparisons, but very much in a different way than the way in which, say, social anthropologists are interested in comparisons in order, if you remember with Radcliffe Brown, to create a kind of taxonomy of different forms of social organization. This, as a famous British structuralist, Edmund Leach, said, is just a form of butterfly collecting. If you want to be a proper scientist, you have to go deep underneath those comparisons to find the underlying principles of things like correlation, opposition, transformation, abstract things like analogy between different symbols and meanings, homology, inversion, figure ground reversal. This is the language of structuralism, the language of describing the patterns that these systems of signs that make up society and culture display. So, for example, Levi-Strauss's 4-volume masterpiece in many ways called the Mythologique, which was a 4-volume study of mythology in the continents of the Americas, really goes to town with trying to correlate myths from different parts of North and South America, how different groups are expressing one possibility of the underlying code and at other times are expressing another one, how one possibility transforms the other one, interferes with one another. I mean, this is a really kind of phantasmagoric kind of conceptualization of the underlying possibilities of mythology as a really kind of kaleidoscopic way of thinking for Levi-Strauss. One way you could summarize this is that for Levi-Strauss, anthropology is something like a qualitative mathematics. He's interested in these functional algebraic relationships between these code-like structures, right? And the content of these code-like structures are qualitative, as I was saying before. High, low, moon, sun, male, female, blue, red, yellow, all of those possibilities are qualitative, but he wants to mathematically correlate them, right? And this is a process, very, very French, of deduction rather than induction. So if the British are famous for being quite inductive in their approach, think of the way that the British law works with the precedent of common law, the French are very much on the deductive side of things. Everything should follow from an underlying principle, right? Think of the great philosopher René Descartes, who tried to deduce everything from a very small set of fundamental principles, right? This is very much Levi-Strauss's game as well. He likes to deduce things rather than induce them, so to speak, or induct them. Another beautiful part of Levi-Strauss's thinking is the analogy that he makes with music as well as language. So music for Levi-Strauss is the supreme mastery of human knowledge. Why? Because music for him, and of course he had in mind in a very kind of French bourgeois way perhaps, classical music above all. He talks greatly about opera and Wagner and all this kind of stuff. He's talking about the way that sounds are distributed according to patterns, the vertical pattern of harmony, the horizontal patterns of melody, right? The different orchestrations that a composer might come up with, right? These are all analogies for him of how culture works, because it's all about pattern, about distribution of elements, both in space and in time. What this allows for in Levi-Strauss is a beautiful, actually, in my mind, and actually in some ways intimately connected with much more recent debates about colonialism and anti-colonialism in anthropology. There's something very, very kind of powerful in Levi-Strauss in the symmetry that he establishes between the sophistication that he finds in the phenomena that previous anthropologists might have seen as somehow more simple and associated with more primitive forms of human society and culture. Lévi-Strauss will have none of that. He says that the degree of complexity found in mythology in Amazonia or kinship in Aboriginal Australia is absolutely of the same order as the kind of highest forms of mathematics or painting or music to be found in Europe. So he seeks to use this structuralist method as a way of leveling out hierarchical distinctions between the West and its colonial conquered rest, as it is sometimes figuratively referred to, right? So he tries to flatten out the distinction between tradition and modernity in some ways, right? This, for him, this project, as I said, in his early part of his life, is part of a kind of scientific study of humanity, and in fact, as we'll see, he connects some of these pattern-like structures that he's interested in, or all of the possibility of having pattern-like structures in the first place, with the way that the human brain works. So in some sense, early Lévi-Strauss is also a kind of ancestor of modern-day cognitive anthropology that I mentioned in previous clips. But as he moves towards the latter part of his career, those 4 volumes on the study of mythology, he begins to be interested in patterns for their own sake. The principles of transformation, of pattern upon pattern influencing each other without referring it back to an underlying reality such as the structure of the human brain, and an emphasis in conceptual and analytical experimentation become more and more prominent and exciting in Lévi-Strauss's work. And in some ways, this is what we associate, as we'll see, with people who came after him, both in philosophy and in anthropology, who are sometimes tagged as post-structuralist philosophers. One thing to note is that structuralism was enormously influential in France, and Lévi-Strauss became a figure of reflection and critique also for many of the philosophers that came to define the late 20th century in France, people like Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, Lyotard, Roland Barthes. I mean, these kind of French, Lucie Irigaray, kind of French post-structuralist philosophers can in some ways all be seen as reactions to Lévi-Straussian structuralism, attempts to kind of take it forward in new and exciting ways. And Lévi-Strauss, in some ways, in his own work, participated in being post himself, being, if he is structuralism, he's also post-structuralism in some senses, right? So I think I will